want to start my lecture today by asking a series of questions. What does Islamophobia mean when we start, not from 9/11 as one marker, for example, but from the violent dispossession, genocide, and theft of Aboriginal land? What does social justice mean when it was only in 1992 that the law acknowledged the fiction of terra nullius? What is the difference between Islamophobia and Islamophobic incidents? What does it mean to focus on the racial system that emboldens and enables somebody to assault a woman in hijab, for example? The racial system that polices Muslim bodies, speech, and agency. What does equality mean when we account for Indigenous incarceration rates, deaths in custody, and lower life expectancy? What does citizen mean when it was only about less than 45 years ago that the White Australia policy was formally abolished? What does free speech mean when it is denied to angry, racialised people? Who pays the price for national security policies? Whose security is protected and at whose expense? Where does this country, Australia, get its assumptions of sovereignty that justify Australia's illegal offshore mandatory detention system? What does equality of opportunity mean when studies show discrimination against job applicants with Chinese, Middle Eastern, or Indigenous names? To come even close to self-awareness as a nation, we must be prepared to ask and answer these questions. We must also be prepared to accept that Australia is experienced differently by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and by racial minorities. Critical race scholarship offers an intellectual, theoretical framework with which to expose and challenge the invisibility of race and racial power in Australian society, especially in terms of my own particular research interests, which are race, Islamophobia, multiculturalism, identity, nation and counter-terrorism, and the war on terror. My research is heavily informed by theories around race, racialization, and whiteness, and I use critical race theory as a theoretical framework for working through my research questions. I want to start by first giving an overview of critical race theory, moving on to share with you how I apply it in my own research on Islamophobia. Critical race theorists believe that race should occupy the central positioning within legal, educational, or social policy. Just put that back to the other side, sorry. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. And that quote is taken. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure what's happening there. And that quote was taken by one of the readings by two seminal writers and thinkers in the space of critical race theory, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik. I'm sorry, Siri keeps picking up and thinking I'm sending a message. Critical race theory was developed by Black scholars working in the mid-70s in academic legal circles in the United States, and grew out of their frustration with the extremely slow rate of substantive racial reform following the civil rights movement. Critical race theory spread across disciplines and is now regularly taught in law, education, political science, social work fields, and other fields as well. Critical race theory has a few central tenets. First, racism is permanent, and this is key. It is an ordinary, pervasive, everyday occurrence, a systemic condition, not merely an individual pathology. Racism is a vast system that structures our institutions and our relationships. Next is the tenet that white supremacy serves important political and economic purposes. So that's looking at why white supremacy benefits from a racial system and a racial hierarchy, and how it is in its interest to perpetuate and to reinforce and to continue a racial hierarchical system. Next is the idea and the thesis that race is a social construction. So race and races are products of social thought and relations. They are not fixed by biological reality, allowing races to act as categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. And this is an especially crucial point in the context of Islamophobia, because anybody who's worked in the field of Islamophobia, or indeed has ever had an argument with an Islamophobe or heard the rhetoric of Islamophobes, the first thing that an Islamophobe will tell you is, I can't be racist to a Muslim because Islam is not a race. Failing to understand that race has nothing to do with biology, that the idea of races as biological categories is a false one, and that races are socially constructed. And this brings in the idea of racialization, which is the second point, that minority groups are racialized in different ways by dominant societies and in different political and economic contexts. And one example I can provide here in the Australian context is that there was a time when Italians were racialized. They were considered inferior to the white dominant society. Italians are now, for all intents and purposes, have become part of white, sort of the idea of whiteness, and have been almost integrated into the idea of whiteness. They are no longer a problem people. They are no longer racialized as a problem. So in different political contexts, in different times, minority groups become the objects of racialization. Depends on the purpose that racialization serves. And this is a really productive way for thinking about Islamophobia as a form of anti-Muslim racism. The way that Muslims are ranked, categorized, and measured against the normativity and dominance of whiteness. And that's something that I'm going to talk about in the context of my own research, to show you how I operationalize that, how I look at that in the way that I analyze Islamophobia. Critical race theory legitimizes and promotes the voices of people of color by using storytelling to critique dominant social order, helping us understand how law or policy operates in everyday lives and systems of inequality. And so the idea of counter storytelling is one of the most important parts of critical race theory. It's taking the accounts, the testimony, the stories of people of color on their own terms, and seeing that as a way to understand, as a way to see how race plays out in people's lives. Critical race theory, one of the most important tenets of critical race theory as well, is that it is critical of liberalism, of the normative claims of liberalism, particularly the notion that meaningful social change can occur without radical change to existing social structures. And I think maybe we can talk about this in question time, because I think that this is probably one of the key dividing lines among activists who are working in Islamophobia, those who think that we can address Islamophobia within liberal discourses, within a liberal system. If only we could make this secular liberal society better, we could improve it. And then on the other hand, a critical race theory perspective is that actually that system needs to be dismantled, that it is fundamentally a system that perpetuates racism and Islamophobia. And so it's not about fixing a system that's broken, it's about replacing that system. It's about dismantling that system. So going back to the questions that I opened with, my research, informed by critical race theory, proceeds on the basis that race in the context of Australia is everywhere. And you can see here by these statistics, it is so pervasive, so embedded in institutions of power. For example, these pretty horrifying statistics that people of colour in Australia, we already know, but the Australian Human Rights Commission conducted a study in 2018 and found that 95% of senior leaders in Australia are of Anglo-Celtic or European background. 94% of our parliament is white. 99% of our heads of federal and state government departments are white. And there is only one non-white university vice-chancellor in Australia. So in our corridors and institutions of power, we are in Australia still overwhelmingly a white nation. This terrible fact is rendered almost banal. It is embedded in our culture, in our popular culture, in our media. Indulging in the myth that we are all equal denies the economic, political, and social legacy of Australian society that has historically and deliberately been organised by race. Critical race theory compels us to understand how the racism deployed to rationalise European genocide against Indigenous peoples has structured and mobilised and inspired and informed Islamophobic sentiments and practices and structures today. The multicultural Australia we see projected in politics, in our media, our popular culture, our arts, our institutions, is at its core white. And this is when we're talking about racism from a critical race theory perspective, is that race is permanent. It is pervasive, it is the part of the fabric of our society. It's important, it's actually fundamental to understand whiteness in our particular Australian settler colonial multicultural context. And when interrogating Islamophobia in Australia, it is critical that we understand that we are not speaking of whiteness as simply or solely about skin colour, as is often the most popular understanding of whiteness. It is part of the story of whiteness, of course, skin colour, but what we are interrogating is how whiteness functions as a political position in Australian society. And critical race theory, the focus, the entire premise of it is to look at sets of power relations. So as Indigenous professor Aileen Moreton-Robinson, who's one of her chapters I set as the reading, she argues that race is the organising grammar of Australian society, rooted in patriarchal white sovereignty, in a politics of white anxiety over dispossession, shaped by a refusal of Indigenous sovereignty. And I think we need to sit with those words to really understand what Professor Aileen Moreton-Robinson is saying. She's trying to peel back our understanding of race and take it back to its origins in the very foundation and origins of Australia as a settler colony. And that was based on theft, on dispossession, on genocide. And until then, and the refusal and denial of Indigenous sovereignty. So all manifestations and practices of race since that original sin are always referencing back to that anxiety of being caught out by what has been stolen, or having taken away back to its rightful owners what has been stolen. That anxiety over dispossession is based on that refusal and denial of Indigenous sovereignty, that this is unceded land. Aileen Moreton-Robinson writes that whiteness is constituted by the intersection of identity, institutional practices, and discursive power, which function as symbols of national belonging and nationhood. And this is a really key point, and it's something that came up time and time again in my own analysis of the way in which Muslims and the Muslim community in Australia are spoken about and spoken to within the context of such catch cries as Australian values, as national security, as Team Australia, as Judeo-Christian values, all these sorts of discursive ways of categorizing and ranking people as either inside or outside are always rubbing up against this idea of whiteness. The reason I assigned Aileen Moreton-Robinson's article as reading is I think it brilliantly offers us a framework for understanding Islamophobia. Again, bringing us back to who is Australia? What is Australia? What is race and whiteness in the context of Australia? And the way I thought I could try and explain this is the Christchurch massacre, for example. So with the Christchurch massacre, we have here a lot of the commentary around that. Just get here. A lot of the commentary around the Christchurch massacre, which I analysed in my current postdoctoral research, treated white supremacy and the terrorist attack as an ugly, violent aberration. It was considered an anomaly, something that was outside of Australia. We've got the rhetoric of we are better than that. We are better than this. What's happening? What's happened to Australia? Then there were the rhetoric of, why can't we go back to how we used to be? This idea that it was something that was a complete aberration from who we are as a nation. So we heard, this is not who we are. And yet, if you look at this idea of patriarchal white sovereignty, the patriarchal white sovereignty that refuses Indigenous sovereignty, it shaped the logic of a young white Australian man who carried out a murderous rampage against Muslims in Australia's settler colony neighbour on the basis of his anxiety over invasion. This was part of his manifesto. He described immigrants as invaders in the midst of a white genocide and referred to Muslims as the most despised group of invaders in the West. His anxiety over genocide, over dispossession, was a projection of his fears of white people being attacked and killed in the same way that they have and still do attacked and killed Indigenous populations and brown people globally in the war on terror. In the words of Morton Robinson, the unfinished business of Indigenous sovereignty continues to psychically disturb patriarchal white sovereignty. And this is how we see it play out, this constant anxiety of having done to white people, to the white dominant society, what the white dominant society did in order to achieve that dominance. That is the haunting that undergirds and structures racism in this country. So I want to take you now through how I've used critical race theory in my own work. In my PhD, I examined Islamophobia. So this book was based on the PhD from the point of view of Islamophobes. And so I basically interviewed people across the spectrum. I interviewed those on the far right, and these interviews were conducted predominantly in 2015, 2014. And this was a time right before Reclaim Australia and the United Patriots Front had mobilised and become more popular and had become more normalised. When I first spoke to these groups, they were pretty much losers out in suburbs. I met them individually over coffee in Balmain, in Newtown, and they were basically they were so desperate to have an audience that it was very easy for me to make contact with them and meet up with them, because very often Islamophobes, the irony is that they feel that their voices aren't heard, that they don't have a platform, that they are the oppressed group, the irony of that. So I met these people who before they were even on the television screens 1 year later, and that was quite frightening for me to see how quickly things changed in Australia, how normalised and how quickly it was mobilising with global power actually, and global references and inspiration and motivation. And so I interviewed people on the far right spectrum, those who were telling me they wished that they could set up abortion clinics in suburbs with large Muslim populations so that they could just get rid of Muslims before they were born, to those who wanted to have a return to the White Australia policy. And then I also spoke to those on the opposite end who would claim I'm not racist because I have a Muslim friend, or I eat kebabs, or I've travelled to the Middle East, but then would proceed to explain to me why Muslims don't fit in and they have different values to us. So I wanted to really look at that whole spectrum. And then I also interviewed non-white Australians, so people of colour, and groups of those who were actually anti-Muslim, looking at the way the idea of the model minority and how the model minority was employing and borrowing Islamophobic language to police the behaviour of Muslims, but how this was always within the setting of a white Australia and of these groups thinking that we need to behave or we're going to be kicked out. You have to be the model citizen in order to be comfortable in Australia, because if you rise too high, if you get too comfortable as an Australian, then you're going to make it a problem for all of us. So you need to, toe the line. It was very interesting for me to speak to people who held these views, but to also see the way that whiteness, again, influences those who think that they are so free and equal, and yet are still haunted by the idea that they have to follow certain rules in order to fit in. My approach when I started was to think about Islamophobia in terms of Islamophobic practices, but very quickly I started to understand that I couldn't start at 9/11, for example. that I had to really understand and peel back what race meant in this country in order to understand what was happening and why Muslims were being posed as a problem people. And so that meant that I had to interrogate theoretical concepts around race, racialization, racialization processes, whiteness. And I did that to interpret everyday practices and lived experiences. I took seriously the worldviews and testimonies of the people I interviewed, while at the same time subjecting them to critical analysis to explore how their views about themselves, about nation, about multiculturalism, Islam, Muslims, minorities, always arose from their social relations and what power relations gave force to them. And race was central to my analysis. So we can see here some examples of some quotes from people. You can see here, multiculturalism is only good when someone comes to Australia, and they come to Australia for the purpose of living in a fantastic country. They follow our rules and they come here without the intention of changing that country into something else. So here we have the idea that this is a multicultural country, but according to this Anglo-Australian, you need to follow our rules. So immediately we have an us and them, and immediately we have the entitlement to police the borders, the entitlement to decide who gets to belong, who gets to live the way that they want to live. And I used Ghassan Haj, very much his work on white nations, so governmental belonging. It's a really powerful analytical framework for thinking about not just the fact that there are those who think that they can police and have a sense of entitlement to determine who belongs, but where does that entitlement come from? Why do they feel that they have this sense of governmental belonging, that they are acting on behalf of the nation? We have, we're forgetting there is a dominant culture. Australia should remain a predominantly European country, absolutely, and a predominantly Christian country. So there were those who were very adamant that this was a Christian European country and considered that Islam and Muslims were incompatible with that. There were those who, used the language of integration, the language of assimilation, and were very explicit in framing Aussie values as Judeo-Christian values. And I wasn't surprised by that, given that this is the language that we have seen time and time again from our leaders, whether it's John Howard, whether it's Tony Abbott, and there's a plethora of politicians who constantly use the rhetoric of Australian values, either explicitly saying that it's Judeo-Christian values, or it's a dog whistle for that, because it's been embedded enough times in our public discourse that we know that when we're talking about Australian values, it's instantly a signal that we're talking about Judeo-Christian values. My research was framed on the proposition that Islamophobia must be linked with the originary racism on which Australia was founded, the legacy of Australia's status as a British settler colony. So if you want to understand why people are telling me this is a European country based on Christian values, that this is a country where we have set up, the rule of law, Western values, Western civilization, that immediately tells you that you need to think about the original foundational values and systems that started this country. There is a link here to how this nation imagines itself and the claims it tells about and stories it tells about itself. It's important to link it back to past efforts to build a racially exclusionary nation. We are the only nation that had legislation that explicitly legislated for an immigration program based on race. It was in fact Australia who provided the blueprint for apartheid South Africa. We have that legacy to be ashamed of. Then we had the evolution. I needed to look at the evolution from racial to cultural dominance through the vehicle of a highly politicized policy of multiculturalism. I needed to look at Australia's location in the global, westernized, capitalist, patriarchal world system. This is how I analyze the historical and political context in which Muslims are racialized, how they are judged, ranked through the category of whiteness and race. So to understand Islamophobia in Australia using this critical race theory perspective means understanding the material and intellectual histories of racial thinking and practices in Australia. And this then allowed me to mine deeper into the links between those big macro political discourses moral panics and policies, and the way that then they trickled down into everyday interactions, beliefs, and rituals. So, for example, one of the most common things that I came across was this constant referencing to Australia as a secular society, and the idea that Muslims were not fitting in because they wore their religion on the outside. They were too ostentatious, they were too loud and proud, and that religion should be something you keep at home, do it behind closed doors, push it to the background, as one person told me. So there were those who felt a lot of resentment about, for example, seeing Muslims praying in a park, or a halal stamp on food. They considered, as one person said to me, that this was stamping us as Muslim, and they viscerally felt it as an imposition. And the more I looked into this idea of this public-private distinction, the more it forced me to think about the claims of secularism and the history as well of secularism and religiosity in a Christian historical framework. Because time and time again, there was this idea that religion was something that was regressive and backward and puritanical, and something that needed to be private. And so what I found through other scholars was this idea of Protestant faith, the idea that faith is something that you keep private and individualized, and that this was structuring the resentment and structuring the othering of Muslimness, because there were certain aspects of religious faith in a Muslim's life that are external, that have to be on the outside. But this was being interpreted through the framework of a historical, a Christian history, in which you had actual, people talking to me about the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, and the way that, that religion was used as a despotic force. And so they were imposing a Christian history with religion onto the Muslim experience. And that's why it was extremely important for me to understand how this is structuring a certain response to Muslimness. And that again takes us back to the fact that race is central. What does it mean what does race and whiteness mean? It means that it is structuring how you even practice your religion, and it is always referenced to a Christian normative experience, a normative standard, and this is what was happening in the Australian context. So this is what I mean by critical race theory and Islamophobia, taking us into a deeper understanding of the racial practices and histories in this country. Critical race theory challenges the ways that race and racial power are constructed by law and culture. It converges around the belief that racism is endemic and not aberrational in Western society. It is part of who we are. And that liberal legal ideals of objectivity, neutrality, have entrenched rather than undone racism. So again, going back to that example of secularism, the idea that secularism means that the public space is neutral. But what I found was it was not a neutral space. It was not a no religion space. It was a space that was structured around an understanding of religiosity based on a Protestant understanding. The idea that religion is okay if it's private and individualized. So once again, what we're doing there is we are interrogating claims that liberalism makes to normativity and to neutrality, and saying, actually, no, when we dig deeper, these aren't neutral claims. They don't lie, suspended in some neutral space. You are bringing certain values and expectations onto other people based on a certain historical framework there. So my scholarship proceeds on that basis, that race is constitutive of, not outside of, Australia's multicultural policy. And I looked at the logics and imagination that undergirds the problematization of Muslims among the participants that I interviewed, and how political debates infiltrate their responses to Muslims in their everyday lives. So here we've got some more examples. I sought to understand how whiteness enrolls a range of very specific emotional and affective registers. It shapes certain emotional discourses and responses to Muslim bodies, behavior, things, and spaces. For example, seeing a hijab, there was a certain emotional register among people that it felt that something, there were people who told me that when they saw the hijab, a fully covered woman, for example, in the second quote here, it would once upon a time was associated with oppression And now, at the time I was interviewing my respondents, was at the time of the rise of ISIS, in fact. And so what some people were telling me directly was that it was instantly linked to ISIS. And so when they saw a hijab, they thought of ISIS. These sorts of connections and signals were made, and so that this is the way they were interpreting and responding emotionally to Muslim symbols and Muslim bodies, even Muslim spaces. And we have here Ryan, and whose work I actually rely on very heavily in looking at the way geographies of Islamophobia. And Ryan's done a lot of work looking at the way that Western Sydney has been problematized, and the way that it has been framed and constructed as ethnic ghettos, as gangland, and how these spaces conjure up certain negative images, which then trickle down into discursive practices, into physical, attacks and Islamophobic and racial attacks. But again, looking at how it's not just bodies that are the objects of Islamophobia or racism. It can even be spaces and geographies and suburbs that get marked and racialized. And we know this very well in Western Sydney, and it has indeed come up in my postdoc research, speaking with young people, which I'll talk about later, but, speaking with young people who live outside the western suburbs of Sydney, who are very, very explicit in telling me that they don't go to the western suburbs of Sydney where there are large populations of Muslims because they feel that it's dangerous there, that there's more drugs, that there's more terrorism, that is gritty, as one person told me. So even spaces and geographies get marked and labelled, with racialized language and imagery. Now, why is this happening? I wanted to understand, because there's nothing natural or automatic about encountering others from this white subject position, this idea that, I don't like the way you look, therefore you don't belong, or the way that you are living your life in Australia is a problem for me. That you're not born thinking that way from that white subject position. So I wanted to understand how this white entitlement seeps into embodied habits of thinking and speaking in the spaces of everyday life. How do my participants imagine that the way that Australian society should be ordered? And I found that unspoken assumptions about whiteness informed how my participants experienced their own identity and sense of belonging, and how they sought to shape minorities, particularly Muslims' identities and experiences of belonging. So that for me was a very key part of my PhD research, looking at where this sense of entitlement came from. And the critical race theory perspective gave me the opportunity to really bring it back to, well, what does it mean to be a white person in Australia? And I ended my entire research in the book by thinking, so often Islamophobia, and I know this from a personal perspective, having been an activist for many years now, and at the beginning of my years of activism, painstakingly trying to explain Islam, to rehabilitate the image of Islam, to counter negative stereotypes, to speak back to racism by explaining and defending and condemning, I realized that instead of asking, why am I a problem? Why are Muslims a problem? Maybe we can flip that and ask instead, why does white Australia have a problem with us? So we bring the lens, we turn the lens and the focus away from those who are racialized and problematized, and go back to, well, why is it that white Australia has a problem with minorities? And you cannot answer that question without understanding who white Australia is. And that takes you back to the foundational injustice. Again, back to Aileen Moreton Robinson, to understand the psychic power of stealing another, people's lands, and how that then structures your entire society, the racial hierarchy, the systems that you need to maintain that racial hierarchy and ensure that a white Australia and its domination continues. We had the language of it very explicitly up until the White Australia policy, and it's returning now with the rise of the far right. But then there's also the language of liberalism, which often uses certain language to masquerade as, multiculturalism, as diversity, but in fact is just a euphemism for a way of managing minorities. So now I want to talk about my postdoctoral research. And so I've been working with young Muslim and non-Muslim youth in schools and universities across Sydney. And my topic is Trust, Politics, Fear in the 9/11 Generation. I've been working with young people who have only ever known a world at war on terror. So working with young people who were born around 9/11. So they were born into a world at war on terror. I've been exploring how the war on terror has and continues to shape their trust relations in school and university, their political consciousness and agency, participation and expression, and their fears. I've been tracing the sustained ideological and political work which has gone into creating maps of meaning, ideas, feelings, and social images about young Muslims as a common sense category of at-risk youth. And this is something that politicians and the media and policymakers have put a lot of energy into doing since 9/11, constructing this idea of the Muslim youth, usually boys, but that has shifted, as Shakira Hussein has brilliantly documented in her book From Victims to Suspects, this idea that the young Muslim is on a conveyor belt to radicalization, that they are always susceptible to being radicalized. And this has been absolutely embedded in countering violent extremism policies, in countering violent extremism and anti-terrorist legislation. It is something that has been perpetuated and reinforced in academic research, a whole industry around this idea. Someone's microphone is on. This whole idea, this academic industry, cottage industry around the idea of the at-risk Muslim youth. So it is something that I look at I try and trace race and Islamophobia within the policy and legislative framework. And then I look at how this plays out and trickles down into young people's lives. What I'm trying to look at is how this kind of ideological work of the Muslim as at risk leaves its traces on students as they come of age. I ran writing workshops and I follow-up class reflection sessions in 4 schools in Sydney and in 2 public libraries in Western and Southwest Sydney with public school students. The irony for me was that I was going into schools to ask students, do you feel that school is a safe space for you to talk about politics, to work through your political and religious identities, to interrogate what is happening in wider society, particularly in the context of the war on terror and race. And while I was given ethics approval from Macquarie University to conduct this research in public and private and independent schools, I was not given the go-ahead by the New South Wales Department of Education, who said that I would be posing a risk to public school students if I were to go in and talk about these things with them. So the irony for me was that they were framing me as the one who was going in providing an unsafe space for students, and yet the schools that I was going to had provided letters asking and inviting me to come to their schools, and I'm already in those schools and other schools all across the year as a writer and as an author. So I'm in those schools already talking about these issues and about my books. So it was for me a clear ideological decision that they did not want me in schools. In asking public school students where most of the CVE policies are, how do they feel about it? What's happening in these schools, particularly schools with large Muslim populations? So I found that extremely ironic and telling. And I chose to conduct the research that I was doing via writing workshops and face-to-face in-depth interviews because I wanted young people to have the freedom to express themselves on their own terms without constraint, to name their reality as critical race theorists advocate. And remember, at the beginning of the talk, I spoke about how critical race theory is all about counter storytelling. So storytelling is a huge part of it. Now, I have a teenage daughter, so I know that it's very difficult to get teenagers to talk. And so I wanted to have the writing, have the interviews, but also give students the freedom to write and to do that anonymously, because I felt that way I would really be able to give them an opportunity to express themselves without them feeling any judgment or self-censorship. One of the key aspects of critical race theory is that racism is not merely an individual pathology. It is a cultural system which is played out in our institutions. And I really wanted to understand this cultural system and how it plays out for young people growing up in the war on terror. So it was very critical for me to look at the institutions in the war on terror context, the institutions of, the way that academia has been complicit in the idea of the at-risk Muslim youth, the idea that Muslim students are on this conveyor belt to radicalization, the way that policy in schools has perpetuated this myth and this gross attention to Muslim young people, young Muslims' political acts, speech, their exploration of their identities, their religious identities, the way that certain expressions and markers of religious faith get laboured under the labour of being cast and racialized as potential markers of extremism, as something that, warning signs. So looking at the way that race really seeps down into these practices. So my project wasn't simply about offering a descriptive study of experiences of Islamophobia or youth identities. I really wanted to interrogate the political and symbolic violence exercised against young Muslims by the state and so-called neutral policies and political practices in a war on terror context, and how this leaves its traces on both Muslim and non-Muslim youth. So looking at the way that race and Islamophobia affects not only Muslim youth, but non-Muslim youth as well, in the way that they are trained to see certain people, bodies, practices, suburbs in a very racialized way, if they are actually absorbing messages in the media and political speech and discourse. So I wanted to understand how young people experience, enact, and resist this violence. And I wanted to understand how years of countering violent extremism policies, political and media rhetoric, and community partnerships have normalized a hypersensitivity and policing of Muslim youth's bodies, speech, and the spaces they move in, and what this means for young people in the context of their everyday lives. So a really good example of this is the way, again, I started at the beginning by saying, people say, oh, you can't be racist to all Muslims because Muslims aren't a race. And yet almost every single young Muslim male that I spoke to was extremely attuned to the way that having a beard, for example, or being of Middle Eastern appearance was enough to provoke suspicion in certain circles, particularly in suburbs where they were outside of their comfort zone. The idea that the hijab could immediately be seen as either a symbol of oppression or as a symbol of a threat. So the way that Muslim bodies, religious practices were weighed down by racialized, meaning and racialized markers was a really, really telling example to me of the way that the war on terror marked people's bodies, Muslim bodies. It racialized their bodies as they tried to move through their suburbs and schools and through their everyday lives. And so I wanted, with the critical race theory approach, to center race in my analysis. Looking now at schools, which is one of the main places I was looking at, and it's crucial to see whiteness as endemic in educational institutions because how these institutions have been historically and still are structured on the presumption that whiteness is the default and universal standard. And in my work, I forensically explore the way curriculum content, the Australian curriculum and the New South Wales curriculum, reinforce and reproduce these white ways of knowing, white histories and stories while disavowing race. And this is a really key point for me that, and again, on the back of amazing scholarship, both here and, in the UK and the US and in Europe, the idea that whiteness structures our education systems. Again, how do students experience this and respond to this? So I argue that race is entrenched in, for example, the Australian curriculum, the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians, which all the states ascribe to, and the New South Wales curriculum. For me, it's an obvious conclusion when you take Indigenous people and racial minorities as your authority on what race means. As Indigenous and Black scholars have argued, the privileging of a white master script, the foregrounding of Eurocentric perspectives, counts as epistemic racism in Western education. So the simplest way I can explain this is that when you think about the sort of books that you study in English, for example, the Western canon is the dominant canon that students are introduced to and which they study. It was really interesting for me looking at the New South Wales English curriculum to see that so many of the books that students are studying are the books that I studied when I was in high school. They are considered, you know, part of the Western canon. Very often the majority are male authors. And very often the dominant writers and the dominant canon is a Western canon. So anything that is non-white is relegated as part of the peripheries. It's an elective. It's never centered. It's always marked in reference to a white norm in our education system. And histories, and the way history is taught is another example of that. I don't have time to go through it, but it's something I forensically look at in the book. In Australia, schools have been found to be the most common setting in which children and adolescents experience racism. And since 9/11, there has been no shortage of studies showing how Muslims are the most negatively viewed minority group in Australia, subjected to hate crimes, verbal and physical abuse, property damage and discrimination, as the Islamophobia Register Australia reports, which Delia is part of, have documented, and annual surveys by the Scallon Foundation, which report over 40% of Australians who answer surveys anonymously hold negative attitudes towards Muslims. Now, given the global circulation of fears and ideas, moral panics of the Muslim other, it's a massive leap of faith to think that anti-racism policies will mitigate the harmful effects of a war on terror climate, which maintains attention on Muslim youth and Islam as problems, in this war on terror context. So critical race theory compels me to think about how what is at stake here is not simply dealing with one racist teacher. Sarah Ahmed, a brilliant scholar, she calls this the bad apple model of racism, which just ends up eliminating racist individuals so that, as she says, institutions can keep their racism. So focusing on racist individual teachers, it reproduces race because it avoids addressing race as systemic and institutional. So anti-racism policies, and in New South Wales we have these, in every state we have them, they address racism, but they don't address race. And that's what critical race theory does. It forces us to look at how race structures all of this, including anti-racism and liberal policies, because there is a very big difference. So addressing racism would mean that an Islamophobic teacher would face consequences for their conduct. And, interviewing students, I came across many stories where they were talking to me about experiences with teachers who were blatantly Islamophobic, treated them in horrendous ways. So if you were going to focus on anti-racism, something would happen to that teacher. There would be consequences, because here we're thinking about racism as perpetrator-based. But critical race theory would tells us that that's like applying a Band-Aid or anesthesia. It doesn't actually fix the problem. It's essential, it's a temporary fix. But if you want to address race in schools, you need to confront these systems and educational institutions as structures around whiteness. And I'll give you one quick example before I close. Abir was a student that I interviewed in year 12. And when she was in year 9, she started to wear hijab. And she was attending a girls' school in Western Sydney, a public school. She says that every morning that she used to catch the bus, once she started wearing the hijab, there were times she felt a little bit unsafe. But then there were a few times that as she was walking to the bus station, there was a bus from a nearby boys' school which would be passing by, and there would be a group of boys who would throw things at her and yell things at her and scream abuse at her. And it happened several times, to the point that she ended up telling a teacher at her school about what happened, and the teacher and the principal acted very swiftly. They went to the other school, reprimanded the boys, spoke to the teachers, and acted very quickly to address that issue. And she was very happy about that. 2 years later, in that same school, her sister published a brilliant article in the Sydney Morning Herald, her sister and another student, talking about Australia's treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. And in that article, they wrote the name of their school. They were completely reprimanded by the principal and their deputy principal. How dared they publish something political and associate the school's name with it? that girl who had been the subject of that abuse quickly realized that her sister had expressed herself politically, had been very forthright about having a social justice agenda, had called Australia racist, and and tried to expose Australia's racism, and had suffered consequences for that, been shut down. And so she decided that she would spend her year 11 and 12 completely politically mute. She would not talk about politics. She would not express anything that was remotely going to be considered to be political, and she basically self-censored. So what we can see there is the way that the school itself addressed a racist incident, but race and the idea that a minority population can voice their disgust at racial policies was something that they could not accept and could not abide. And you can see there how these two can sit happily and in perfect harmony when you have a system which only pays attention to racist and Islamophobic incidents, but doesn't address the structuring race at the heart of these institutions. And so this is something that I address in the research. And the last thing is that I also interrogate, using critical race theory, the university space. So looking at how race in the academy as white institution impacts on Muslim students. And I've written a paper about it, and it deviates from many studies by framing my analysis in terms of a comparison between Muslim and non-Muslim students in non-Muslim white students in higher degree institutions in New South Wales. I'm trying to operationalize whiteness in a settler colonial society as my central category of analysis in looking at the academic space. So I'm exploring how Muslim and non-Muslim students experience and respond to the university as a white institution. So I'm less interested in racist incidents in the courtyard or buying lunch at university. I'm less interested in those interpersonal experiences, and more interested in what does it feel like to be a student where you are learning a curriculum that is structured around white ways of knowing and white histories. What does it feel like to be in a system which refuses to decolonize? And what does it feel like, and how do white students experience their normativity and their invisibility in the university? Because one of the things I found speaking to white students, university students, was that they took the curriculum for granted, that they rarely saw that it was a white curriculum. And it was only when it was pointed out to them by other students, for example, in the case of one student I spoke to via Facebook, coming across why is my curriculum so white, a Facebook page, that they started to think, oh, yeah, so in a philosophy course, I am mainly learning about Western philosophers, as though the philosophy of the rest of the world is completely non-existent or irrelevant, and starting to understand that whiteness is an identity, that it is not something that's neutral, is an objective, that it is an identity that is dominating, and how that impacts on their movement in the university space and sense of entitlement, empowerment, and how that affects Muslim students as well. So, three takeaway points from today. Islamophobia is often explained as a problem of behavior and attitudes. And I think it's important that we don't ignore the world historical thick context in which Islamophobia emerged as a form of racism in the making of the modern world. Race and whiteness, we should not only think about them in terms of skin color, but as a set of power relations, as Charles Mills argues. And critical race theory allows scholars to understand how the organizing settler colonial history of Australia has developed and informed the way that formations of Islamophobia are expressed and practiced in Australia. And it's very, very important to constantly refer back to what race means in Australia in terms of the original violence and dispossession of Indigenous people. That is not something that is irrelevant or something that you can tag on, as a separate issue. It is absolutely embedded in our understanding of what Islamophobia means in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randa. I think we took the advantage of your, community side and knowledge side. You made it so clear.
I hope so. It's a lot to take in.
The theory, not that much abstract. It is very much interwoven with your case studies. So I think it was really clear to all of us. And please, everyone, join me in applauding Randa virtually. Clap, clap, clap. And yes, I'm sure you need a break, Randa, after speaking for about an hour. And maybe if we can give a short break for a few minutes to go and grab just a cup of tea, coffee, or water, and then be back, please, because it is a online webinar mode. We don't want to give a big break. And you're welcome to stay here and answer a few engaging questions. And in the meantime, some of us can go and grab a coffee or tea. So also introduce you CISAC, Center for Islamic Studies and Civilization, which is organizing this Theory Time series. It is an Islamic Studies department at Charles Church University. And we are offering Islamic Studies in bachelor's, master's, PhD level, also classical Arabic master's course and contemporary Islamic Studies. A master's is also offered within this program, and we have these courses. You're welcome to visit the Charles Church University, and if you write CISAC, you will be able to see the details about the courses. And
sorry, go on. Sorry.
Yes, and I think this time really made university experience quite unique. Everyone is online now, and we are trying to, I think, connect each other. And yes, now I think we are diversifying the profile of students being online and accessible to everywhere. Yes. Yes, Randa.
Oh, I completely forgot to share something.
Yes.
I'll just.
You want to share your screen? Yes.
Yeah. So I'm here. If anyone wants.
By the way, Semra, can you start recording? We don't want to forget it.
If I am where is it? Editing this special paper for that journal on historicizing Islamophobia, if anybody's interested. So February 2021 is the deadline.
Okay.
So if you go to that website, or if you email me, I can send you the call for papers, and you can see what sort of things that we're looking for that issue. It's a special issue, given the approaching 20th anniversary next year. Looking at Islamophobia. That's the Journal of the Contemporary Study of Islam, which is based out of the UK.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's okay. You can just email me if anybody's interested. Yeah, I'll just put my email. I'll just put my email.
Put it on in the chat box, please.
Okay.
And then we can open the ground for discussion. Suha, do you want to ask a question? Okay, Sarah, yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Randa, for an amazing presentation. We met at the conference.
That's right, Deacon.
Deacon, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure to meet you at then, and it's a pleasure to see you again virtually today and listen to what you had to say. And I've read your book. It has been very foundational for my research. My research is on Islamophobia, and I'm looking exactly at activism, Muslim community organizations' responses to Islamophobia. So it turned out that some of the Muslim community organizations I spoke to, they are very aware of the systematic nature of racism that is embedded in Australia, and its connection to white privilege and white power. So that the awareness is there, and I've captured that in my research. However, it's the reaction, it's the response that is puzzling me, and I was wondering if you can help me in unpacking that through using critical race theory, because I've been reading about the tenets of critical race theory, and one of the tenets is storytelling. But there is a difference between storytelling and counter narratives, right? Story narratives and counter narratives. And basically, my finding says that we can diminish Islamophobia if we provide a counter narrative to whatever discourses are there, to whatever narratives are there that vilifies Islam and Muslims. And without going in depth in the ways by which they try to project that counter narrative, let's just if you can just explain to me from critical race theory, how could anyone provide a counter narrative for systematic injustices that is entrenched in the system? And I know that it is part of critical race theory. How do they deal with that in that aspect, theoretically speaking? And what's the connection between counter narratives and empathetic fallacy? Because in critical race theory, empathetic fallacy is when you think that you can change through providing counter narratives, but basically you're not, because it's systematic, it's entrenched, it's foundational, the racism in the system. So I see contradictory here. If you can elaborate on these two concepts, empathetic fallacy and countering narratives, how are they used in critical race theory?
I think the key sort of fault line is how are those counter narratives being deployed, and is it being deployed with an understanding of the power relations in which those counter narratives are being offered, or is it not? And very often when you have Muslim community organizations, for example, issuing statements of condemnation or statements explaining a position on Islam in response to something in the media or a statement by a politician, it's very often with a real lack of awareness of how they are playing into a racial system which demands that they condemn, which demands that they observe a certain script. It's very often either a really naive understanding of the way that they are being used to perpetuate a certain narrative that is often then used against them. So, for example, the many times that organizations have released statements of condemnation, and very often very quickly you see that those statements are never enough, that you are always, that the media, that the politicians are always playing those organizations and people to continue to speak in different ways that they want them to speak. And what happened with the Mufti after the Paris bombs is a perfect example of that. You're probably very aware of that case where he released a press release, and then he was in which he asked for, as part of his statement expressing condolences for the people of Paris, in which he had one paragraph talking about the underlying causes, and was completely condemned across the media, across the political landscape by no less than the Prime Minister, and completely vilified for that, for daring to speak off script. And so very often there are organizations who don't realize, who are very naive about the way that their statements are very much in line with a certain political discourse. That, for me, is where critical race theory demands that you understand that it's not just about offering a counter narrative if you don't understand the power relations in which that counter narrative is being offered. So as Muslims, our instinct is to explain and defend and to talk about the true message of Islam. What we're failing to understand is that Islamophobia and racism is not about misunderstanding Islam. It's not about misunderstanding Muslims. They're not interested in the real definition of jihad. Islamophobia is not going to go away if everyone has a 101 guide to what Islam really teaches. That is not the point here. It's about the power relations. So I think that analyzing the responses of Muslim organizations and their activism in terms of their understanding of these power relations is key. Sometimes refusing a counter narrative is is the most powerful thing to do. Refusing to legitimize a certain narrative by responding, to dignify it with a response, to dignify it with a condemnation or a rebuttal, is in and of itself an act of refusal and dissent against a racial system. But I think it's very counterintuitive with Muslim organizations and community representatives, because they feel either a moral obligation to defend Islam, or they are very much switched on to address the immediate impact of something. So, the immediate impact of, a spike in Islamophobic incidents against Muslim women, for example. So they want to try and diffuse a situation. Again, there's lots of complex, multiple intersecting pressures and, countervailing sort of issues at stake here that I have the luxury to think through as an academic in an activist space, and I work in both. As an activist community space, it can be very different, and I think that community organizations need to really think about the way, in the war on terror especially, their activism has been used against the Muslim community. Community partnerships is a prime example in the countering violent extremism, thinking that working with a countering violent extremism agenda in partnership with government, as a sort of using funding to produce good, that there's again very naive thinking there about how there's a failure to understand how that perpetuates and reinforces race, and so I think that that's just important to understand that.
Can I follow up?
Before Sarah, is it related to Randa's comment or another question?
The same question. Can I just?
Sorry, yeah. If you can quickly ask, yes. Then.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Randa. What if the organizations or the entity that is trying to respond is fully aware, is not yet naive whatsoever? They're fully aware of the power relations that exist, and the dimensions of Islamophobia as beyond ignorance and entrenched within the system. However, they have no other pragmatic way of doing things, and they're obliged. There is a certain ceiling that they can't exceed, and there are positional practices that they have to do in order to be functional. Otherwise, they're just going to be paralyzed by the system, the same system which is against them. So and going back to theory, because we want to talk theory today, how if the entity understands these underlying foundations of critical race theory, and it understands it as foundational to the problem of Islamophobia, but so how can they provide a counter narrative upon that understanding? Let's say they're not naive. Let's say that they totally understand what's going on.
Yeah.
How do they? Yeah.
Who is their audience for this counter narrative? So what do you mean by counter narrative?
Non-Muslims. They're whenever I speak about counter narratives with Muslim community organizations, it's always about providing an alternative to their dominant discourse that is taking place with regard to women, with regard to men, with regard to peace. Islam is all about peace. So that it's always trying to show the opposite of what is inherited in Islamophobes' minds. So that's the kind of counter narrative I'm speaking about. And so if they understand that it's systematic racism, they do understand that, but still, they do understand that, and then they produce counter narratives. Isn't that in line with critical race theory? Because it's about counter narrative.
I think it's just really important to understand what is the purpose of the counter narrative. Like, if it is to explain a position to Islamophobes, that just legitimizes and reinforces race. I think that what we need is to mobilize a critical mass of people whose counter narratives, the purpose of those counter narratives are to expose race in this society. The more people who are talking about what race is in Australia, the more people who are refusing to dignify narratives which place and shift the blame and the onus and accountability on minority communities, but say, no, you explain why we are, you explain to us why you need to to maintain this racial system, shifting that onus back. I think that it's about building that critical mass of people. So the counter-narrative serve the purpose of exposing race, unmasking race, constantly pushing back against these racial narratives. I think that's what Muslim community organizations need to be doing. They don't need to be thinking about, there's a time for dawah. You know, I'm not interested in the way that dawah gets conflated with activism and political work. There is dawah work, but then there is political work, and that political work needs to build that critical mass of people who are going to start the revolution. And revolution takes knowledge. It takes people constantly naming the problem, and that's what critical race theory is about. Let's name the problem of whiteness. Let's name the problem of what Islamophobia and race is in this country. That for me, it's always about what is that purpose of your counter-narratives and your audience? Is it part of a social justice agenda that is bigger than just maintaining the status quo, or do you want to smash and decolonize that status quo? Admittedly, there are certain organizations that don't have that, that won't be able to do that work, but then they shouldn't get in the way of those who do. So, of course, all organizations have their own pressures and parameters and audiences and different needs that they're serving. But the most important thing is that the political work takes place, you know, and that those who can't do it don't get in the way or dismiss those who do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Randa. Mariam has a question for you. She says, you did emphasize that Islamophobia is linked to the issue of Australia's whiteness, but I wonder if there are any studies that show there are certain indicators where certain tendencies of anti-Muslim racist attitudes have increased due to or as a response to certain events in the Middle East.
Oh, yes, of course. So, I mean, it's very important to understand that, you know, when we approach Islamophobia, we often, a lot of the work, first of all, thinks of it in terms of 9/11. I mean, a lot of the recent work in the last 20 years, you know, marks the beginning as 9/11. What that does is not only, you know, totally efface the world historical context, or even in an Australian context, the fact that a lot of the rhetoric was building on the rhetoric after the Gulf War, but it also, it starts to construct the image of the Muslim who is the subject of Islamophobia as an Arab, rather than thinking about, well, how does it feel to be a Black Muslim even before 9/11? You don't need a war in the Middle East to have moved through society as a Black Muslim, for example. Our analysis of Islamophobia tends to erase the experiences of Black Muslims and see it very much in terms of the lens of the Middle East and the war on terror and the Gulf War, failing to understand that there is, you know, rampant anti-Blackness that is intersecting with anti-Muslimness, let alone the anti-Blackness within the Muslim communities and that complexity as well. But to respond to your specific question, of course, when we're talking about the Gulf War and, you know, the, you know, really key, huge scholarship around that in terms of the impact of Arab and Muslim communities, because of course the conflation of Arab and Muslim happens very often. But then of course the global war on terror and the proxy wars that we have seen in the Middle East certainly affected the way that Islamophobic practices and expressions then manifest in Australian society. And you can see that, for example, I saw that with my own research in the way that, you know, within the period of my field work, I started my interviews before ISIS declared its caliphate. And then during my interviews, it declared it. And then I saw very quickly that some of the rhetoric that people that I was interviewing were using was directly referencing what was happening in the Middle East. So of course, global events impact on local fears and local rhetoric and on local prejudices and hates.
Ryan has a question for you. Yes, go for it, Ryan.
Hello, Randa. It's very good to see you again.
Good to see you.
You're awfully familiar, I was going to say. Well done, Randa, on an awesome, as always, a great paper. And we can talk all week about ideas that you prompted me to think about. What we both have in common is that for our PhD theses, we interviewed Islamophobes. Yeah. And you and I both know, Randa, that is extremely draining. Good on you for continuing on with it, especially both of us being Arab, both of us being Minfalis from Palestine. It is definitely very draining. And what I liked about your paper was how you touched on the importance of utilising Indigenous perspectives and understanding anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia through the lens within this context of understanding how it links to Indigenous people. There is unfortunately a reluctance among scholars of colour, as we both know, to contextualise anti-Arab racism or Islamophobia by omitting the experiences of Indigenous people. I suspect this goes without saying, I'm not. I have an ability to read your mind. I suspect it's because we're both Palestinian in that we see the struggle here similar to what our families and our peoples experience over in Palestine, and I think that's why that we come at it from that solidarity. And I just think it's definitely. I hope that in the future, the starting point, like you said, of examining Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism isn't 9/11, which unfortunately remains the dominant lens among even those compassionate and supportive of Arab and Muslim peoples. It definitely needs to involve understanding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experiences of racism in terms of marking out critical race theory and Islamophobia. I'm going to leave it there. Sorry, I can talk all night, but thank you, Shukran. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Yes, good to see you too. And I'll just quickly make a point, picking up where you spoke. Not only is it incumbent on us to understand Islamophobia, in the context of Indigenous dispossession, if you want to understand the practices of the war on terror, for example, the surveillance, the state's encroachment on liberties in terms of the right to protest, for example, the right to be political, then you have to look at it in terms of the colonial practices that were first practiced on Indigenous bodies, because there is a historical continuity there. It's not exactly the same and it's not playing out the same, but it was tested and perfected on Indigenous people first. Those continuities are really important to understand, so that you don't start to think of the Muslim community as an exception in terms of the way that racism and racism is practiced in Australia, because everything that we are experiencing was practiced on Indigenous bodies first, and in a much more horrific way, and until today and to date. And so just in terms of understanding why it's happened, how it's happened, but also in terms of hope. And Sarah, you were talking before about, I kind of got the feeling that, what's the point? Because it is something that critical race theorists get, if race is permanent, if race is something that's part of our society, then what's the point? How can we fix it, But the biggest hope is first knowledge and solidarity. And, if I woke up tomorrow and Islamophobia was gone, I should still feel disturbed at the fact that I am on stolen land and that Indigenous people are oppressed and have, are the most, incarcerated population, lower life expectancy. Building solidarity is what is going to dismantle the system. And so that's a really important social justice agenda that critical race theory offers us.
Absolutely. Dadia, if I can just say something really quickly.
Really quickly, yes.
And I think it's really important when we understand Islamophobia, how it's articulated. And that's why I really liked how you added Aileen Morton Robinson's work on the white possessive and on white patriarchal sovereignty as one of the readings, because it's important to realise that the narratives that articulate Islamophobia among white nationalists or people of colour who are caught up, they defend an idea that's based on Indigenous dispossession. They're defending a colony at the end of the day. And that's why it's so important to situate Islamophobia within this context as part of a broader racist colony. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Mustafa Al-Gashangi, did you raise your hand?
Yes.
Please jump in. Yes.
I did. Thank you. Jazakallah khair, Randa. It's always a pleasure listening to you. And, I'm going to kind of like plug myself in here because alhamdulillah, I was very lucky to kind of like make a featurette in one of the works that you wrote when we spoke about wonderful Lord of the Ring marathons and Dungeons and Dragons. So
yes.
I'm glad that I've got that notoriety there. But I suppose my question, Yani, and you'll have to forgive me because the idea isn't so crystallized in my head yet. So the question is, how do we understand, whose power are we talking about when we look at groups that are, I suppose, doubly racialized? But when we talk about whiteness as the overarching power structure, what about within Muslim communities, for instance, that you touched on it previously in your last answer, where the Arabs kind of think they're superior to non-Arab Muslims, or that kind of the rabbit hole kind of goes so deep, because then we start talking about, what about ableism, and what about feminism, and what about transphobia, and what about homophobia. So I suppose when we're talking about racialized communities, like who's got the power there for us to dismantle?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't fall into, like, it becomes sort of oppression Olympics when we think about it in terms of
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that means that we do lose focus. So there's no doubt that there is lateral violence within the Muslim community, racism that absolutely and urgently needs to be addressed and systematically addressed, in Australia and across the board. One of the most surprising and sort of disturbing things that came out of some of the things that were happening on social media at the time of, last week with the election, the US election, was hearing and reading some Muslims supporting Trump because, as though because he was better for the Middle East, apparently, versus Biden, as though the experiences of Black people in America, in which a huge proportion are Muslim, but it shouldn't be important, but as though the experiences of Black people is irrelevant to Muslims. So it immediately erasing the very existence of Black people and Black Muslims. It's really disturbing kind of on social media to see that. And I think that is a symptom of something that's very deeply embedded in the Muslim community, because it's not just an Arab superiority, although that is a huge issue, but then, you've got the subcontinent and then, sort of colorism there and, attitudes towards Black people. So that's something that as a Muslim community, we absolutely need to address. But I think that, in my first, PhD research, where I did actually look at this chapter that when the otherizes. And so when I was looking at, Greek and Italian and Lebanese Christians. So I interviewed them and their anti-Muslim rhetoric, it was always something that I was able to contextualize within the context of a white society. When you look at intersectionality, then you can, that is the antidote to looking at things as oppression Olympics, to understand that, yes, we occupy multiple positions and intersecting identities, and that can make our experiences of racism or ableism or or classism, all these sorts of things, a lot more complicated. But I think that from a critical race theory perspective, when you center race, that is the main reference point in Australian society. And we didn't create it that way. That's how this society was set up. It was set up as a white nation. So the reference point, the center point, is how society was set up, was not something that Black people decided on or disabled people decided on. That was how this country was set up. And so that is the focal point. And then you see how class and gender and religion all intersects and pushes back against that. I hope that. Yeah.
No, it has. It's just, I mean, from an outsider's point of view, it's like incredibly deflating, because, I'll read the autobiography of Malcolm X, for instance, and I'm like, yeah, man, like, dismantle that. But then I'll read like bell hooks, criticizing Malcolm X because of his views towards women and kind of the assumptions that he makes under the Nation of Islam. So it's like, where do we start?
I mean, that's sort of like the question is, how, like, what are the goals of the revolution? Who decides on what the agenda is, and but I think that one step at a time, and just the idea that if you understand what we're up against, what is the organizing grammar of this society, it is race, and then you can really understand, like, when I was talking about Aileen Moulton Robinson, that patriarchal white possessive, that it all intersects with each other.
Got ya. No, Jazakallah khair. I appreciate that.
Randa, we have a few comments and questions. Maybe if you can shortly answer them, maybe they are also related to each other. One is there any role that can be played by individuals, institutions, and political leadership of Muslim majority countries? Another question asking similar to that by Inas, she was asking what can the Muslim community and individuals can do, especially considering their mental health, well-being, and also adding my question to that as well. When you said not fixing but deconstructing, and this is too hard, should we say critical racist theory is pessimist, or do they have a hope in reconstructing completely rather than fixing? I understand the logic behind why it cannot be fixed, but in a way it sounds to me like pessimistic as well.
Okay, so the first one about Muslim majority.
Yes.
The Muslim majority countries. So Muslim majority countries are pretty much, for all intents and purposes, led by despots and dictators. And that's why, it's people power, and we can really see hope in the way that, community organizations and political movements on the ground, grassroots organizations, are building global mobilizations. And for me, that is the most positive and energizing thing to come out of the way that we are talking about these issues on a global scale now, especially because of the role of social media, means that we don't need to appeal to power structures. We can build that critical mass. And when we think about Muslim majority countries, they in themselves are the victims of, appalling practices that oppress them and that take away their political agency. But we can see as well that there are so many grassroots organizations at an individual level and grassroots level which are reaching out and building that solidarity. The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement out of the Palestinian civil society is a perfect example of that. Up against the Israeli settler state, they have been able to appeal directly to people to build that critical mass globally, and that for me is where the power lies. The next question would like to what can everyday Muslims do, Muslim organizations, including the role of mental health and well-being? The first thing I would say is that when I was in my PhD, I got really down in 2015. There was a point where I really was affected by all of it, and especially interviewing Islamophobes. The most liberating and energizing thing that has ever happened to me is to understand that it is something that is not my fault. That just because when you realize that it is not a problem of individuals, when you realize that it is a problem of the way that our society is structured, it means that it takes the onus away from me. It means that, it's not about dawah. If my dawah work isn't working, then I become a failure because Islamophobia still exists. But when I actually realize it's not about individuals, it's about a structure that's bigger than me, then it means I can build solidarities. When I think about what is the most important thing that individual Muslims can do, it is to understand the indigenous perspective. So for example, at the moment, Professor Gary Foley in Melbourne is running something called the Black Fire series. And I encourage everyone here to look it up, and it's only $20 per class. It's online. Watch it on Zoom in your own time. It has been phenomenal. Amazing insight from Indigenous people themselves about the history of this country and race. And it has helped me understand Islamophobia without him using the word Islamophobia once, because I understand race in this country. It's understanding the continuity of practices. Knowledge is power. So that for me is the most, I wish more Muslims would understand the indigenous history of this country. That will empower them to understand how to fight Islamophobia. The role of mental health and well-being, again, knowledge is power. When you understand what you're up against, then that helps you understand how to address it, and it takes away the feeling of helplessness. That for me has been instrumental in understanding what we're up against. And then the last question was about pessimism. I actually feel that it was through critical race theory that I was given an avenue of hope, because I understood, first of all, that history matters, that understanding that this is bigger than just, a public relations campaign gone wrong when it comes to Islam, that it has nothing to do with people misunderstanding what Islam is about, that it is about power. When you understand that it is bigger than someone just hating me as an individual, then I feel that there is hope, because first of all, it is knowledge that it is not my fault, but then it means I can build solidarity with other communities. And, for example, I attended a Black Palestinian conference last year in Melbourne, and I came away, speaking to two of the most oppressed groups that you can get. And the level of energy and hope in that 2-day conference was phenomenal, because solidarity away from the state is an amazing source of hope, because it is people power in the end. And for me, that is the best antidote to pessimism, is the power of people. And we know that the power of people can change entire systems. For me, that's where the hope lies.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Hila has a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Daria, and thank you so much, Randa, for that beautiful presentation. It was very informative. Me coming from a background of researcher doing researching racism and Islamophobia in Australian political discourse, so much looking forward to your new book about war and terror, Islamophobia and Australian politics. I really like the definition of Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism by yourself. There are different definitions, but this is the definition that really I want to present in my paper as well. I've been always leaning towards racism, Islamophobia as racism, as anti-Semitism. And I wanted, what I'm doing in my theory, just quickly, I'm going to say this, that I'm focusing my theory as securitization of religion and framing theory from the state's perspective, framing theory, how they're framing Islam with securitization theory. But I really want to use this critical race theory there as well. I am briefly discussing racialization there as well. So I was wondering if there is any space for me to merge critical race theory with the securitization and framing theory there.
Yeah, there is. So if you email me, I've got some really good references actually for you, a lot of work that's come out of the UK, because that securitization of the Muslim community is, you know, far more extensive and more entrenched and institutionalized in the UK. And so they've got some incredible theorists who have been doing work on this. And I think that there are a few that I could name that if you email me, I'll send their work to you.
Sure, thank you so much. And thanks for today.
And also there was a comment from Rosalind, I think she was saying also how crusades are portrayed in the history is also an example of, I think, institutionalized racism embedded in the curricula.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, that even with my PhD, when I submitted to my PhD, I dedicated a whole first chapter to going back through what Islamophobia has meant since, you know, even before the Crusades, and to understand the rhetoric and the language that we hear now borrows a lot. Particularly, you know, if you will recall when we had Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, there was a lot of, and John Howard using that imagery of, you know, the Holy War and, you know, the imagery of, you know, Judeo-Christian values and, you know, a crusade. There was that kind of language that was embedded in their rhetoric. It's absolutely haunted by and borrowing from that history. And again, it's so important to understand those continuities, to understand what we're up against now.
Yes. All right, thank you. Is there any question that you would like to ask to Randa or comments? I think it was a very heavy, intense.
Can I ask a question, please?
But it was very light in the way that you presented. I think that's really mediated the heaviness of the topic, I think. Yes.
Inshallah.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So firstly, I need to say thank you very, very much. And my question is about the inherent inferiority complex that we have. It's usually within the communities that are being discriminated against. For example, once I was trying to discuss an issue about an Australian policy, something that the government is doing, and I thought that was not healthy or not good. And the moment I started discussing the topic, I was told off. And I said, you're a migrant, you need to be thankful and just keep quiet. You're not supposed to participate or to have an opinion or to try to solve anything. You just need to be thankful and just keep quiet. So perhaps I was thinking maybe the first thing that we have to do before moving to the white Australians or the white, maybe we have to address ourselves first.
That's a really key point that came out of the interviews with non-white participants in the PhD research. The internalized racism was really impacting on their sense of political agency and expression, so that they often felt that they could not fully, be themselves, because they always were had to play the model minority, and that if they stepped out of line, that's when it would be a problem. And we've seen countless examples of that in public figures. So Yasmin Abdel-Majid is a perfect example of somebody who said something that was off script and was, completely condemned and vilified for that. And, it happens time and time again, even with Indigenous people, like someone like Adam Goodes, who dares to embrace his Indigenous identity rather than just be the quiet, meek athlete. So we see that this happens time and time again, that kind of internalized racism. And sometimes it's a strategy, a survival strategy. But I think that for me, it's more excusable for first generation migrants. When you come to the second and third generation, there's a real sickness there if it's continuing. And it shows the power of race to manage minorities who can have, 2-3 generations and still feel that they need to follow certain rules. And they don't realize that the goals are always shifting anyway. So it's never going to be a time when you are fully accepted. So the better position to take is that you don't need the acceptance from the white majority. And I think that when people realize that it is that you don't need the approval of a white majority, and actually that if you want to understand your position, understand it from the point of view that you are on stolen land, understand it from the real owners of this land. And some of the most beautiful people that I've met are Indigenous people who talk about how it hurts them when minority communities ignore the fact that they are the original owners, and that we look to the white centre for acceptance. We look to the white centre for tolerance, not realising we don't need it from the white centre, because that is an immediate disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty. I think we need to reframe what our position is in this country, and that takes knowledge in terms of our relationship with Indigenous owners.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Daria, I have a question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Randa, how are you?
Alhamdulillah.
I've really enjoyed listening to you, actually.
I've been
reading a lot about critical race theory, and I guess that dates back to discussions I had with Yasser a long time ago. You first introduced me to the concept, so I've been looking at it ever since. But anyway, I do have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
One is around the historical causes of Islamophobia, and two is a question related to CVE, because you touched on CVE. I might start with that, actually, my question on CVE.
Okay.
The position that the ICV has taken is that, and we took this even in our position statement that we issued a little while ago on Islamophobia, is that it does drive Islamophobia. CVE, counterterrorism laws, they do drive Islamophobia. What sort of reception have you received in academic circles and more importantly in policy circles to that proposition?
I will find out next year because I do systematically go through the CVE policies and programs, and I have looked at certain academic think tanks and certain academic research, and the footnotes can reveal who that is. So I have been scathing about the complicity of certain academic circles and their participation in jumping into this cottage industry of CVE at the expense of the Muslim community. Even if they have so-called noble intentions, it has harmed the Muslim community so much because of this construction of that at-risk Muslim youth. And also, if we see Christchurch and the rise of white supremacist nationalism and far right, that has been totally ignored, pre-Christchurch, and Muslim communities have said, shift your CVE gaze onto white communities who are mobilizing underneath your noses while you focus on the Muslim community. So I'll find out next year. And the first question was about the historical
causes of Islamophobia. Yeah. But I mean, when we looked at some research and we looked at starting with Orientalism and the first encounter between Christian Europe and the emerging Muslim civilization. You can see a lot of the stereotypes really emanate from that period. Have you done any specific research on that and how that actually has seeped into Western consciousness and
Yes.
thinking?
So in the first book, in the book that was based on my PhD, I look at it in terms of the rhetoric used about Islam as a backward religion, a regressive religion, looking at the way that the language that was used against Muslims in the, the 8th century, the 9th century, developed into, I look at that historical continuity and the way that it's absolutely connected to the way that the Muslim faith was demonized at a certain time, and then how that demonization then evolved, in a colonial context. It is completely part of that picture, which we often forget about, that this is a longer history than 9/11, and that's what we need to work through.
Just one quick follow-up to that, if I could, Sister Daria. Has there been anything new over the last, since 9/11, or even just, since, has there been any new contribution to that, the damaging stereotyping that happened centuries ago? Has there been new thinking that's been added to that? Or is it effectively, it's just repackaging of a lot of these old, stereotypes and concepts?
That's a really good question. I think that, but the way I tell it in the book is that Islamophobia is like a story, and that it has different villains and actors at certain stages, which sometimes borrow from the characterization of before, but also then develop new forms of characterization based on, events that are happening. So, for example, when ISIS emerged, you had, actually the perfect example is Muslim women, who have historically and almost uniformly been represented as oppressed and meek. Then when you had this idea of the jihadi bride, you saw the rhetoric shift, and now it is the Muslim woman as suspect, as Muslim woman as a dangerous, weaponizing the hijab as an agent of terrorism. So there have been ruptures in that historical sort of narrative based on what's happening in the world today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's no question. We should wrap up. Normally, we were planning to finish 15 minutes earlier because we didn't have any break, but the audience was so much engaged and we had really questions, very good questions, that we couldn't stop. Thank you very much, everyone, and especially to Randa. Thank you very much for this, I think, intellectually provoking night. And we look forward to your book, Randa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was such a privilege to address you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And